All right, so the topic tonight is the thought of Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. I've called it, I think, traditional thought in a non-traditional world. It's not exactly a Jewish controversy, although he was a controversial figure. I mean, later on in his life, he became like not so controversial. Possibly because he wasn't occupying any official office for the last 7 8 years of his life. But you know, he was an important figure. I mean, certainly you hear me quote him in drashot frequently enough. I was asked if I would teach a session on his thought, which I'm happy to do. So you know, one of the things I remember, somebody commented a few weeks ago about one class that it was more a history lesson than anything else. And I will tell you, I mean, my academic training is mostly in history, but I think that if you don't understand history, I mean, you know, and I like the history of ideas, but ideas have context and people live in certain contexts. And I think people's ideas and their biographies are often very much intertwined. So I want to give sort of a brief biographical overview of Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. He was born in London in 1948. His father was a textile salesman, and his mother came from one of the leading families of wine merchants in the UK. He had three brothers, and I find it very interesting that his brothers' names were Alan, Brian, and Elliot, okay, which are not exactly like frum Jewish names. And it's a little bit more understandable when, and I found this fascinating when I looked up his biography, is that although he was known as Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, right, and Jonathan is a Hebrew name, I always find it bizarre when somebody's given name is a Hebrew name and yet their Hebrew name is a different name, right? And he was not Harav Yonatan Sacks. He was Harav Yaakov Tzvi Sacks. So even though his English name was Jonathan, his Hebrew name was Yaakov Tzvi. Okay, so that tells you, to me anyway, if you understand the sociology of that, like just like you look at my name and you see it's Charles, and you know I don't come from a frum background, right? He was educated. His family was nominally Orthodox, but they were not particularly observant. And he wrote that his father did not have a lot of Jewish education. Rabbi Sacks was educated at Anglican private schools, and then he went to Cambridge, where he got a master's in philosophy, and he subsequently earned a PhD in philosophy from the University of London. But while he was at university, he had a sort of spiritual quest or a spiritual epiphany of sorts, and he took time off from his studies to come to the United States. And in the United States, while he was here, he met with Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik at Yeshiva University, who was known as the Rav. He was kind of, you know, the leading thinker of modern Orthodoxy. And he also met with the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And he said that Rabbi Soloveitchik taught him that he wanted to learn, and the Rebbe taught him that he wanted to lead. And so he went back to the UK and he decided to become a rabbi. And he actually had two rabbinic ordinations, one from Jews College. And again, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the UK scene, but Jews College, which is now known as the London School of Jewish Studies, that was or is the main seminary of the United Synagogue in the UK, okay? And the United Synagogue in the UK is not the same as our United Synagogue, right? The United Synagogue there is nominally Orthodox. So he got one ordination from Jews College and another ordination from Eitz Chaim, which is a more sort of black hat yeshiva. And then he became a pulpit rabbi from 1978 to 1990. Simultaneously, from 84 to 90, he was the principal of Jews College. And he became the chief rabbi in 1991, and he retired in 2013, and he passed away this past November. It's worth talking a little bit about the role of the chief rabbi in general, okay? Because this is something that we don't have in the United States. I mean, as I sometimes joke, actually we do, but nobody recognizes my authority. But it's not a joke when you talk about the UK, because we're very often you heard that Rabbi Sacks was the chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, right? He was not the chief rabbi of the United Kingdom. He was the chief rabbi of the United Hebrew Congregations of the UK and the Commonwealth, which means what? He was the chief rabbi of those who accepted his authority as the chief rabbi. And who did not accept his authority as the chief rabbi? Well, everybody to his right and everybody to his left, right? I mean, there's the United Synagogue in the UK, which is sort of mainstream Orthodox or modern Orthodox, but understand that the UK is different than the United States, right? In the UK, most people who are not particularly observant nevertheless belong to Orthodox synagogues, right? And they may drive there, they park a block away, whatever. They don't, they're not necessarily observant, but sort of the state Judaism is orthodoxy. And along with that, Jews College until very recently did not actually give rabbinic ordination. The chief rabbi was the only rabbi, was the rabbi of every synagogue in the United Synagogue, and the people under him were known as ministers. And you got a diploma of a minister, and it was not uncommon, and it's still not uncommon for rabbis of United Synagogue congregations to be called reverend or minister, and to even wear like clericals when they officiate at services and so on. So there is the United Synagogue, and then there are two other organizations. There's the Federation of Synagogues, and I think Addis Israel is the other. But anyway, they are more right-wing Orthodox, more traditionally Orthodox, and they don't accept the authority of the chief rabbi. And then, of course, there's the Masorti movement, which is the British equivalent of our conservative movement. There's Reform and Liberal. The UK has two different, like Reform is more traditional and Liberal is less traditional, right? And they don't accept the authority of the chief rabbi either, but probably, I don't know the exact figures, but I would guess that probably 80% of affiliated Jewry in the UK does accept the authority of the chief rabbi. But he played an important role in the UK as a public intellectual, okay? And this is something that doesn't really even exist in this country, I don't think. I mean, who's a public intellect, right? Who's a thinker that everybody knows, right? I'd be hard pressed to name one. I mean, partially maybe because this country is so broad, so big, there are no real national newspapers like there are in the UK. I could throw out the name David Brooks and you all would know who he was, right? but I don't think the average American necessarily knows who David Brooks is, right? For better or for worse. Um, but there was also the role of the BBC, which is also something that we don't have. But the BBC has this thing called a thought for the day, and Rabbi Sachs gave the thought for the day often. And from what I've read, he was one of the few people who actually said something instead of merely offering platitudes. Okay, so he was an important public intellectual, well known, across society. I mean, for example, he was very close with Prince Charles. He was very close with Tony Blair. He was and eventually he was appointed to the House of Lords. He became Baron Sachs. And he joked about how funny it was as a rabbi to be addressed as Lord. But at the same time, because of his position as chief rabbi, okay, and in a certain sense, I mean, why is there a chief rabbi in the UK? There's a chief rabbi in the UK because they don't have the kind of separation of church and state that we do, even though he's not a governmental official, right? But there is the Archbishop of Canterbury, who is the head of the Anglican Church, right? And then there's the Cardinal Archbishop of Westminster, who's the head of the Catholic Church in the UK. And so when the Jews started to become like more part of society in the 1800s, they said, we want somebody who's going to represent us the way the Archbishop of Canterbury represents the Anglicans and the Cardinal of Westminster represents the Catholics. We need to have a chief rabbi, right? And so the role of chief rabbi is as much, as we say in Hebrew, klape chutz, right? He's like the ambassador. He's the ambassador to British society on behalf of the Jews, right? And so he often found himself attacked from the left and from the right. Okay, I mean, the first example was the Rabbi Hugo Green affair, right? Rabbi Hugo Green, Gryn, was a Reform rabbi and an Auschwitz survivor who was very, very prominent in interfaith dialogue. Okay, and when Rabbi Green died in 1996, Rabbi Sachs didn't go to his funeral. Okay, and he was attacked, I mean, not only by, people to his left, but by people in the United Synagogue as well, who said, Rabbi Green was an important figure, beloved, very important in interfaith work, and the chief rabbi should have been at his funeral. Okay, but he didn't go to his funeral, and he got attacked for not going to his funeral. So what did he do? He went to his shloshi. He went to the memorial service 30 days later, and of course, what happened? He was attacked by the more strictly Orthodox, right, for having gone because, and so it was a problem. And then he wrote a letter in Hebrew to the more strictly Orthodox rabbis. Look, I had to go. I know that he was a heretic. I know that he destroyed the faith, but I had to go because of the way it was perceived in the public. He wrote the letter in Hebrew, and then the letter was leaked to the press. Okay, so it was a whole big scandal. Okay, so in 2002, he became really a major world figure with the publication of his book, The Dignity of Difference. Okay, and this was what really made him, like I say, a world figure, not just among Jews, but in general. Okay, so I'm going to share with you, because actually when The Dignity of Difference came out, I published a review of it. So I'm going to share with you, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but to give you some ideas of what he says in The Dignity of Difference, because I really do think it's an important book, and I have recommended it to people very often over the last couple of decades. Okay, so the book is a response to 9/11, and it begins with a visit of a diverse group of world religious leaders, including Rabbi Sachs, to Ground Zero during the January 2002 World Economic Forum. All right, and he said that looking around at his fellow participants in that visit, he found himself, quote, wondering at the contrast between the religious fervor of the hijackers and the no less intense longing for peace among the religious leaders who were there. Okay, and Rabbi Sachs notes that pretty much all religions hold peace as a value, but religion is just as often a source of conflict as it is a source of peace, right? And if you don't believe me, look at what's going on in Israel right now, okay, where frankly, religious people from both sides of the divide are gleefully throwing logs onto a burning pyre and then pouring gasoline on it, right? And you know, so religion has definitely been a source of conflict. And this is what Rabbi Sachs says why. He says, most religious leaders speak in the following terms. Our faith speaks of peace. Our holy text praise peace. Therefore, if only the world shared our faith and our texts, there would be peace. But Rabbi Sachs says that path does not lead to peace. Peace means living with those who have a different faith and other texts, right? And I think that that's so. I mean, how many times do people like, well, you know, our religion teaches peace, and if everybody just followed our religion, there'd be peace, right? Which is true, I guess. You know, although the Jews may be a counterexample of that, because we don't necessarily want peace between ourselves either. But you know, it's easy to get along with people who think like you, right? The trick is to get along with people who don't think like you, right? And Rabbi Sachs goes on to say that the Abrahamic or monotheistic religions in particular are often criticized as a source of conflict because they can tend to tribalism. And Sachs agrees that this has often been the case, but he says that in today's world, there's another danger that is no less potent, and that danger is universalism, or what Sachs calls Plato's ghost. According to Sachs, this is the idea that in the world of ideas, difference is resolved into sameness. Particularity is the source of conflict, prejudice, error, and war. Universality is the realm of truth, harmony, and peace. And again, I think he's right. I mean, we those of us who are, you know, inhabitants of the university-educated Western world almost automatically think that universalism is better than particularism, right? Universalism is at a higher moral level than particularism. And Rabbi Sachs says this is wrong, okay? He says exaggerated universalism can have disastrous consequences. It leads to the belief, superficially compelling but quite false, that there is only one truth about the essentials of the human condition, and it holds true for all people at all times. If I am right, you are wrong. If what I believe is the truth, then your belief, which differs from mine, must be an error from which you must be converted, cured, and saved. From this flowed some of the greatest crimes of history, right? And that type of universalism, right? I mean, it is true that religion, particularly Christianity, but sometimes Islam, have killed people in the name of that universalistic idea. But so did, the French revolutionaries, the Reign of Terror, and certainly so did Stalin and Mao and Pol Pot, right? And if you, for that matter, Hitler, right? So if you want to just count up numbers, right, I think more people have been killed in the name of secular universalism than in religious universalism, right? But Sachs argues that the supposed moral superiority of universalism over particularism is wrong-headed. The universality of moral concern is not something we learn by being universal, but by being particular. We learn to love humanity by learning to love individual human beings, right? And I actually, in my message Wednesday morning, I quoted Rabbi Sachs a lot, right? Because I think that there's a dilemma. I mean, we should feel bad about Palestinians who are being killed. But as Jews, we support Israel. Doesn't mean that we agree with everything Israel does, right? But we're concerned, right? There are concentric circles of concern, right? And we're concerned for our family before we're concerned for others, right? I mean, Hillel summed that up nicely, right? If I'm not for myself, who will be for me? But if I'm only for myself, what am I, right? And so Sachs says that, like I said, we learn to love by loving individual human beings. And so Sachs says that what we need is not to give up our particularity, but for each of us to see our own specific tradition as telling only part of the story. Rabbi Sachs writes, God is greater than religion. He is only partially comprehended by any faith. We need a faith which is like being secure in one's own home, yet moved by the beauty of foreign places, knowing that they are someone else's home, not mine, but still part of the glory of the world that is ours. Okay, and I mean, Rabbi Sachs is not the first person to write in this vein. There was a very important American theologian named Howard Thurman, who was a mentor to Martin Luther King and many others, who wrote, before you can feel at home everywhere, you have to feel at home somewhere, right? But that if you are secure in your own place, then you don't have a fear of others, right? And I certainly my own history, right? I mean, I can appreciate the beauty of Catholicism, and there is a lot of beauty there, but it's not mine, right? But I can appreciate it, and I can gain from it, and I can benefit from it, right? So Rabbi Sachs says that in such a vision, each of us remain passionately attached to our own particular religious community, but we view other communities as part of God's plan for the world because there are other stories, each written by God out of the letters of lives bound together in community, each bearing the unmistakable trace of his handwriting. And here are the sentences that got Rabbi Sachs in hot water from this book. God has spoken to mankind in many languages, through Judaism to the Jews, through Christianity to Christians, Islam to Muslims. No one creed has a monopoly on spiritual truth. Okay, and so what Rabbi Sachs has done here is intellectually, I mean, there are different, I mean, if you study interfaith relations and the history of that, there are different types of I don't know the word I'm looking for, right? But we talk about tolerance or toleration, right? And tolerance or toleration means basically I'm right, you're wrong, but you have a right to be wrong, right? I don't have to kill you because you're wrong. I don't have to put you in jail because you're wrong. I don't have to take away your rights because you're wrong. I will tolerate you, right? And look, for most of Jewish history, if we had been tolerated, that would have been great, right? Because throughout a lot of our history, we were not even tolerated, right? But beyond tolerance, and by the way, there was a book that came out a few years after that called Beyond Tolerance by Gustav Niebuhr, who was the religion correspondent of the New York Times, and I appear in that book quite a lot. But beyond tolerance, so then the next step beyond tolerance is inclusivism. Okay, what does inclusivism mean? It means, look, it's not necessary for me to say that your religion is totally wrong, right? Because there are things in your religion that are a lot like my religion, right? So to the extent that your religion resembles my religion, it's partially true, right? It's partially true. And if you look at, the Meiri, he said this 800 years ago, right? And Maimonides says this in a different way, right? That he admires Islamic monotheism, but they don't accept our texts, right? And the Christians accept our texts, but they're not monotheistic, right? So, but so there's room for them so that's inclusivism. But pluralism is a step beyond inclusivism, right? Which is to say that, there are different revelations, or at least, they're at least potentially, and here Rabbi Sachs quite explicitly said that, right? God has spoken to mankind in many languages, through Judaism to the Jews, through Christianity to Christians, through Islam to Muslims. No one creed has a monopoly on spiritual truth. Okay, now, when he wrote this in the UK, right, again, he got, very much slammed by those to his right. He had been invited to address a major Orthodox rabbinic conference, and the invitation was withdrawn. He had to fly to Manchester to meet with a group of rabbis critical of his book. Why? Because Sachs' statements implied that all religions, even Judaism, contain only partial truth, and non-Jewish religions are ways in which God speaks to those who are not Jews. All right, so Sachs basically recalled his book and took out the offending sentences. I happen to have a copy of the original edition, and not only is it a copy of the original edition, but it's inscribed to me. But he withdrew the book and rewrote it slightly. He said that one or two sentences might be misunderstood, and added that the book was written for Gentile audiences and was not intended for Jews. Okay, which is the same thing that he said, about going to Rabbi Green's shloshim, right? I had to, because it would look bad, it would look bad to the non-Jews. Now, the one thing let me stop here for a second, because I've been speaking a lot. Are there any questions or comments so far? Yeah, Alan.
Sachs is a wonderful thinker. I've enjoyed reading what he's come up with. It's just from our Counting the Omer. I've enjoyed reading about some of his theories. The articles you gave us, I've seen some other articles. But at some point, he needs to take a couple lessons from Liz Cheney, because he's so involved with, he's so interested and so influenced by the politics that he sacrifices the ideals and the ideas, and it lessens him as an intellectual, in my opinion, than he would have been. I think he's a fascinating character, but it is absolutely a hubris of me to say this great man had confirmation bias, but to a large extent he did. We're the only way, but then again, there's other good ways too. He's fascinating in that way.
Yeah, look, I think he was probably the right man in the wrong job. Having said that, would he have become the important world figure that he was had he not been in that job? But there's a price to be paid, right? I mean, there's a price to be paid. I mean, God knows I don't say everything that I think either. You have to, when you're, I mean, not to compare my job to his job, but you have to be careful sometimes, right? And I do think it was unfortunate. I mean, I think it was, that may have been a personal characteristic of his as well. I think it's unfortunate, right? I do. Now, I want to go on a little bit to discuss a couple more things about the book. Okay, so Sachs. I mean, I think that this book, as I said, I've recommended it to many people. It's a beautiful poetic sermon. I'm not sure that as a work of philosophy, it's as strong as it is as a sermon, okay? Because Rabbi Sachs argues that the diversity of the natural order indicates that religious diversity is in accordance with God's will. Okay, and I've used that same analogy myself. I mean, way before I ever heard of Jonathan Sachs. I remember in 1996 or 1997, this is going to be a little bit weird, but I had a conversation. I don't know if anybody besides me remembers the name Sacheen Littlefeather. She was a Native American activist who, when Marlon Brando turned down his Oscar, she went up to give his speech turning it down because of the treatment of Native Americans. And I actually met her many years later, and we had a nice conversation. Sometimes people just open up to me. I don't know why. But, she asked me, wouldn't it really be better if there was only one religion? And I said, I don't think so. I think God likes having a lot of different flowers in his garden, right? I mean, would it be better if there was only one type of flower? I don't think so, right? I think God likes having a lot of different flowers in his garden, but I intended that as a metaphor, right? I mean, Sachs goes further where he says that the diversity of the natural order indicates that religious diversity is in accordance with God's will. Okay, and I think philosophically that's a mistake, right? I mean, the fact that something exists doesn't mean that God approves of it, right? I mean, unless you have a unless you really believe that everything that happens in the world is literally God's will, right? Which is certainly not a Jewish belief, I don't think. I mean, if that's so, then, the Holocaust was God's will, right? I mean, to argue that something exists means that God wants it to exist, I think is a very poor argument. But having said that, I think it's an important book, and I really appreciate his defense of particularity and his. I mean, he makes a distinction between absolute truth and universal truth. Okay, and here's where he really shows his Orthodox roots, which is something that I would not go as far, right? In other words, he says that Judaism is absolutely true. Absolutely true. The Torah is absolutely true. It doesn't mean it's universally true, right? In other words, that God does make different revelations, right? That the revelation of Judaism is 100% true, but it is aimed at Jews, right? And there could be other revelations that are aimed at other peoples. All right, and I believe this. I mean, this is a way for religions to live together, and to respect the diversity that exists, and to learn from each other. Um, but then, when he goes on to say that means that even Judaism is only partially true, that these are the kind of things that that kind of gets him in hot water. But I think it's an important book. When it came out, I was the Jewish staff scholar at the Institute for Christian and Jewish Studies in Baltimore. He did a US tour and we were his hosts in Baltimore. I got to spend a day with him, which was great. And he was very much the British gentleman. I mean, perhaps this is why Americans loved him maybe more than the British did, right? I mean, he had this very high class, educated Oxbridge accent, impeccably tailored. I mean, sleeves, cufflinks, I mean, dressed beautifully, like, great Savile Row, black suit, white shirt, black tie. I mean, and, he was really, really a nice guy. I mean, he really was a nice guy, and it was a pleasure to spend some time with him. But his legacy vis-a-vis communal leadership is mixed, because on the one hand, he tried to maintain his Orthodox credentials. On the other hand, there's a fact that the UK Jewish community is not just Orthodox. So he kind of reached this compromise where he would appear with non-Orthodox rabbis, like I said, klape chutz. In other words, with discussion of anti-Semitism or Israel, or even, I don't know, healthcare in the UK or something like that, he would be on a panel with non-Orthodox rabbis, right? But he wouldn't discuss Judaism with non-Orthodox rabbis. Okay, which meant, for example, that he would not only would he not appear, but he would not let other rabbis under his jurisdiction appear at limud. Okay, limud, I mean, now there's limud all over the world, but it started in the UK. It was this big couple of day long celebration of learning where pretty much anybody could teach. And he had actually gone to Limud before he was the chief rabbi, but once he was the chief rabbi, he wouldn't do it anymore. And then when Rabbi Sachs retired, and his successor, and it's very interesting, I will say this, that you can tell where a prior rabbi had problems by who they hire as his successor. Right. And so, Rabbi Sachs was a brilliant intellectual, not a great pastor. His successor, Rabbi Ephraim Mervis, who's a warm teddy bear of a man, is a great pastor, Nobody's ever accused him of being a great intellect. I'm not saying he's stupid, but he's not a thinker of the stature of Rabbi Sachs. And one of the first things that he did was go to Limud and let the rabbis under his jurisdiction go to Limud, right? Which was, I think, a popular decision. Now, of course, Rabbi Mervis had a more Orthodox background than Rabbi Sachs had, so maybe he didn't feel the need to prove his credentials, or maybe he just realizes that nothing that he does will lead them to accept him. So why bother to try and satisfy his right flank? Alan.
Rabbi, when I read, Rabbi Sachs had how many, 20 books, 19, 20 books that he wrote. You've talked about the dignity of difference. I'm assuming you've read most, if not all, of the other books. What book, this is a very unfair question, but as a first book to read, if you didn't read The Dignity of Difference, what would you read?
I mean, it depends on what you're interested in. I mean, he had books that really talked about Judaism to Jewish audiences, and he had books that were broader. Okay, so it depends on what you're interested. So, but this is a good segue, because I do want to talk about the rest of his thought and issues that he wrote about. Okay, so
Rabbi, maybe the difference is that we all assume that we know what the word Judaism means. Meaning, even those rabbis who attacked him, they were working under the assumption that Judaism is one uniform idea that they had in their minds.
Sure.
And it's not true, because Judaism is a collection of thoughts for over 3,000 years from many, many different societies, right? So
no, I look, I think you're right. I mean, there's a certain, Haredi mindset, right, which is that Judaism is one thing, and it has never changed. It's always been the same, and Moshe Rabbeinu wore a shtreimel and a kappata and spoke Yiddish, and that
sure.
There's, no, but if you see children's books in Borough Park, right, you see that. I mean, so, there is a certain, right, I think you're right. I mean, that's the difference. I mean, look, there's a reason why Haredim don't want their kids to go to university, right? Because, I mean, Rabbi Sachs was not only Rabbi Sachs, he was also Dr. Sachs and Professor Sachs, right? And so, and this really sums up to a certain extent his whole project, really, I think, which, so, all right, so let me talk about some themes, okay, in his work. Universalism and particularism, I mean, I kind of spoke about that already, but, he notes, for example, that the Torah begins with what? The creation of humanity, right? But it soon becomes the story not of humanity, but of one family, right? Abraham and his family, but then it becomes the story of a people, right? So that, and Rabbi Sachs would say that the message is not just for the Jews, the message is for everybody, but values and teachings are lived out, in concrete, in families and individuals and so on and so forth, right? So now here's one thing that I really like: hope versus optimism, okay? The unique Jewish message to humanity, according to Rabbi Sachs, is that the world can be better tomorrow than it is today, and that we all have a responsibility to make it so. I mean, in other words, and I've quoted this in Drashot over the years, he says that the Torah really invents the concept of hope, right? That history is moving in a certain direction, and that tomorrow can be better than today, which which is not necessarily the case in Eastern thought, right? I mean, nirvana is not the same thing as redemption, right? Nirvana means you get off the wheel, right? But the wheel continues. You're just lucky enough to get off of it, right? But for Judaism, right, we're moving towards geula, towards redemption. Okay, but optimism and hope are not the same. Optimism is the belief that the world is changing for the better. Hope is the belief that together we can make the world better. Optimism is a passive virtue, hope an active one. It needs no courage to be an optimist, but it takes a great deal of courage to hope. The Hebrew Bible is not an optimistic book. It is, however, one of the great literatures of hope. Okay, and I love that distinction because, I mean, you look around the world, it's really hard to be optimistic, right? But we have to be hopeful, right? We have to be hopeful because, and here I absolutely accept that distinction. Making the world better is in our power, right? Whether we grasp that opportunity or not is up to us, right? But we can do it. Okay. He also says that faith carries with it a responsibility, and he talks about contracts versus covenants. Okay, and his weekly Torah commentaries that he published for many years was called Covenant and Conversation. Okay, and that's no accident. Okay, he says covenants and contracts are different things and address different aspects of our humanity. In a contract, what matters is that both gain. In a covenant, what matters is that both give. Contracts are agreements entered into for mutual advantage. Covenants are moral commitments. Social contract creates a state. Social covenant creates a society. Social contract is about power and how it is to be handled within a political framework. Social covenant is about moral commitments, the values we share, and the ideals that inspire us to work together for the sake of the common good. Okay, and here I think, and I don't think Rabbi Sachs ever explicitly wrote about it, but when you read a lot of his writing on this theme of covenant, what I believe he was trying to do was make the case that Jews in the UK are as British as anybody else, right? Because, you know, the difference between the UK or other European countries, right, versus the United States, right, is that if you ask a British person what makes you British, they could say, you know, my blood, it's my genetics, right? We've lived here for 1,000 years, right? Americans can't say that. What makes you American is subscribing to a certain covenant, right? And he points out how the founding documents of the United States, I mean, he was a huge admirer of the United States prior to, let's say, November 2016. And I mean that, okay, that, you know, that the United States made room for Jews in a way that other societies did not, precisely because it was about ideas. It was about covenant. It was not about birth. It was not about blood. Okay, and that, I think, was his big project. Okay, and here I have to say it's reading Rabbi Sachs. I mean, Rabbi Sachs helped me to understand what it is to be an American. He really did, because it is about ideas, it is about covenant. And it's what I found so infuriating about the former guy, right? Because it was I believe, you may disagree, an attempt to redefine Americanism in terms of nativism, right? And if there's such a thing as heresy, as American heresy, that's it. That is American heresy. And Rabbi Sachs helped me to understand what is so great and what is so unique about this country, and what was and continues to be so under attack, right? So I think that was part of his project, is to make the UK more like his idealized version of America, his idealized vision of America, where Jews can fit in more comfortably than in a UK that's based on ancestry. And finally, all right, he talks about morality. All right, and he says societal freedom cannot be sustained by market economics and liberal democratic politics alone. It needs a third element, morality, a concern for the welfare of others, an active commitment to justice and compassion, a willingness to ask not just what is good for me, but what is good for all of us together. But we can change. Societies have moved from I to we in the past. They did so in the 19th century. They did so in the 20th century. They can do so in the future, and it begins with us, right? And he wrote this, pre-COVID, right? But it was really prophetic about COVID, right? That we have been asked to do things because they're good for society, not necessarily because they're good for us. And we see how, and here's where I think, Rabbi Sachs loved America in a way that only foreigners can, and was often blind to its faults, right? And there is this streak of contrarianism and rugged individualism, and you can't make me and I have freedom, that part of the mess that we're only now coming out of. But so Sachs was an important thinker, not just about Judaism or about religion, but about what society is all about. So I'm going to stop here. And again, if there are questions, comments,
fire away.
Michael.
It's fascinating. You threw so much at us.
Sure.
But I would say that it was way easier to understand the concepts than to accept the labels in front of the concepts. So I guess if you read Sachs, he will carefully explain these labels and their differences, so you get to see what he's thinking, in which case the labels become way less important than the thinking. That was my reaction tonight, was the labels are way less important than the thinking. If you had thrown out the words of the labels without further ado, I don't think that it would have been obvious that we'd all fall into place.
Sure.
There's a whole lot more going on here than we can grab onto in an hour.
No, look, absolutely. And this is the trick, right? This is why I make the big bucks, right? It's like I read this stuff for you so you don't have to, right? But if I have a particular strength, seriously, it is to take difficult ideas and make them intelligible, right? Mike, if you sat down and read Sachs, you could understand it. You don't need me. Sachs is not the Gemara. You don't need me to, but, you don't have the time maybe or the inclination, right? But this is what This is one of the things that I do, is that I take other people's ideas and I help you to understand them. I mean, I think that's an important part of my job, really.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Anyone else? All right. If not, then Lila Tov.
Laila
Shabbat
Tov.
Shalom.
Koach.
Rabbi,
Chag
thank you.
Sameach
That
for
was good.
Shavuot. Thanks.
Very, very, very good. Very.
Didn't answer what other books.
Yeah.
Huh?
Thank you. That was very interesting.
Yes, Rabbi.
Well, thank you.
And sort of makes one want to look into some of Sachs's writings.
Well, if you look at the two articles that I sent out,
You read them.
right, he footnotes where a lot of these ideas come from, right? And so, I mean,
is pretty much a bibliography.
yeah. So if you want to look at really what he says about Judaism per se, probably be A Letter in the Scroll, right? And if you want to look at his sort of more broad writings about society, I think probably The Home We Build Together. But The Dignity of Difference would do that too, I think. I mean, but that's certainly, I think for me, The Dignity of Difference is really the starting point, for sure. All right.
Good
Night,
night.
folks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Lila Tov.
Bye, folks.